12 Against the Gods by William Bolitho. Chapter 2. Casanova. The ultimate problem of character can only be settled by omnipotent experiment. If some Shakespearean god indulged his spite by resetting Shakespeare as the son of a prosperous English labor leader, or Napoleon Bonaparte to be brought up in the ice cream trade at Brooklyn, and attentively watched their wriggles for a lifetime. Without such a vivisection, it is impossible to cut the acquired moulding of education, surroundings, and the very accidents of a career from the nucleus of personality, the I, which is our insatiable curiosity. Nevertheless, it has always tempted presumption to make biographical parallels between heroes, to imagine what Alexander would have made of Caesar's life, or Casanova with Christopher Columbus's, or even more naturally to wonder what they would have done with our shoes, we with theirs. Such comparisons depend on the unprovable hypothesis that behavior is a direct manifestation of unchangeable personality, that in other circumstances Alexander would go on being rash and successful, that Caesar would take his icy courage with him, and so beg the question. The speculation would be more profitable if, leaving ourselves out, the two lives to be compared were as widely different in setting, circumstance, and scope as possible, and not as near. To fancy the interchange of two military conquerors, or two poets, or two explorers and pirates, is to lose oneself in a confusion of shadings. There must be contrast near black and white, to shake out any plausible or simply interesting differences and similarities, to help our understanding of personality and life. In bringing this Venetian, Giacomo Casanova, alongside that Macedonian Alexander, there is no intended humor. Anything the chaste, painstakingly noble demigod of Asia has in common with the disreputable card expert whose summit was an escape from jail, whose memoirs of necessity remain unpublishable in their entirety in the safe of Brockhaus in Leipzig, as long as there is the least censorship of the obscene, must belong to the essentials of the quality of adventurer, which alone they shared. As you will observe, this community is not only one of spirit, in the quasi-physical sense of life force, but still more significantly of trajectory. Missiles shot through the organic tissue of society, they had not only the same ruthless directness, that is, the same incorruptible egoism, and though they certainly did very unequal amounts of damage, the same range, but the same mysterious law of fatal ballistics made them repeat the same psychological and personal tragedy. Giacomo Casanova was the eldest son of a futile and charming fellow, an actor of Venice with a cuckoo's idea of rearing a family. In the family tree were runaway nuns, soldiers of fortune, pamphleteers, an unlucky companion of Columbus, gentlemen devoted to love, war, and literature, fast women, and precocious children. This Gaetano, Casanova's father, ran away from a shabby genteel home after a little slut named Fragoletta, who played soubrette in a wandering troupe of comedians. He learned small roles, which he played badly. When Fragoletta tired of him, he came back to Venice with a company, who played in the San Samuele Theatre. Opposite his lodgings was a respectable shoemaker, Farusi, with a vivacious stage-struck daughter, Zanetta, aged 15 or 16. Gaetano Casanova persuaded her to elope with him. Her father promptly died of mortification, but they married and her mother forgave them. Giacomo, our man, was the eldest. He saw little of his father, who died when he was far off his teens, nothing of his mother, who developed into a practical, intriguing little person, and finally found her fortune in a life engagement in the Dresden State Theatre. Without pain, even with a sort of amused pleasure, when he afterwards reflected on it, Casanova was thus released from the initial responsibility of life. Parents. The purblind benevolence of his grandmother claimed and received nothing but gratitude. She was no obstacle and no influence. It was orphanhood with all its advantages, and as soon as he could walk, he was adopted by 2 foster parents, his century and Venice. This city, at that time, he was born in 1725, was the most dissolute and fascinating place in the world. The days of its magnificent growth were over, the days painted by Gentile Bellini and Carpaccio and Veronese. It was no longer the centre of the world's riches and politics, no longer a world power, no longer the bridgehead of Asia. But in the rich decay of its grandeur, there fermented a life that surpassed the pot-bellied wickedness of old Rome, the vulgar exuberance of Sodom and Gomorrah, by as far as these do the wistful banality of nightlife in modern London, Paris, and Berlin. There may have been good, kind folk in Venice. Casanova does not seem to have heard of many. He presents us in his memoirs with a licentious unity, in which cooperate the faded dignity of palaces, the uncleansable tides of its lagoons, the labyrinthine regions and channels, the incense of churches, like the treasure caves of pirates, the moribund perfumes of musk and civet, and all the mouldering spices in quayside warehouses that once possessed the monopoly of the East. The metaphor of an exotic, unhealthy flower growing on a muck heap is almost compulsory in descriptions of Casanova's Venice. But the decay of her sublime energies and pride, through a coalition of fate and history against her, had produced nothing ignoble, nothing more degenerate than a rich compost, apter for the native European plants, wit, elegance, humanity, than for any orchid. In fact, neither the tropical luxury of the Brazils, where the excitement comes from the sun and not the imagination, nor the morose confusion of Asiatic courts, has any right to compare itself with the exclusively, typically European radiance of dying Venice. It was indigenous as a French fair, an English Sunday, or a German philharmonic. Consequently, this life into which Casanova was born, and where his memoirs are our best guide, did not stand by itself like something imported and accidental, but was a manifestation, supreme in its beauty, of the sick times. This is true of the myriad-shaped 18th century, supporting the infinite detail of other truths about it, that for the deepest sociological reasons, its essential social framework was sclerosed and mineralized like the arterial system of an old man. Politically and socially, it was not, therefore, except in a very gross metaphor, degenerate or decayed at all, but set, arrived at such a development that change was shut out of the natural course of things. Everything was owned, settled, finished. The human race was, as never before or since, the prisoner of its own logic, its own legal geometry, its laws, that is, its past. Neither kings nor peoples could change it. Europe had locked itself in and lost the key. And in the wall which confined them all, there was not the least chink for an adventurer to pass, no matter his genius. Imagine an explosion in a locked room. That is the aspect of the revolution that was to end the impasse. But Casanova came before the revolution. All his active life, he was shut in with the rest. His adventure is entirely internal, inside society, if you like, parasitico-intestinal. The spirit of the age, then, to give it a name and judge it, was not fin de siècle, like the exhausted times of de Maupassant and Wilde, but fin de monde. Everything optimistic, and even provident, was out of date. The secret of the Carnival of Venice was a social despair. On this background, with the colours of an advanced civilization, the Venetian wove that rarest of all delights, a new way of love, love as free of consequence, and as hurried as if they were all tried, sentenced, and awaiting execution in a common prison. An aristocratic, undomestic love, which for supreme distinction was decorated with mystery, the enhancer of all spiritual pleasure. Its symbol was the mask. That Venetian mask, dangerous and intangibly reminiscent, like a visor cut off from the helmet of a departed race of heroes. the last disguise of vice before it lost its conscience and became mere nature. It is this world that adopted Casanova, and which, in gratitude, he has perpetuated in his memoirs so well that it seems his property. The Venice of Casanova, the century of Casanova, which he discovered and conquered, was, in short, a civilization inexorably exclusive of plebeians, but too tired to check claims to title, heartless but universally in love, hostile to adventure but with the gambling fever, in despair but enjoying itself more wholeheartedly than Europe has ever dared to do, cruel and sentimental, superstitious and atheist, in the image of beauty with a mask. His poor old grandmother taught him hardly more than to dress himself and walk. The first influence his life was the patrician Baffo, by birth a full member of the class that ruled Venice. He had a generous heart, was frightfully ugly, famous for his pornographic verses and prudish conversation. He taught the child his letters, and it was on his advice that Casanova was sent to school in the healthier air of Padua, on the mainland, at the age of 9. The mistress of this school was a frightful Serb, who left her charges unwashed, half-fed, and untaught. It is rare for children in such hands to rebel, and Casanova was sickly. Yet, feeling his way, starting by the passive opposition of small thefts, stealing sausage ends and crusts of bread when Signora Squeers was asleep, he progressed until he arrived at the thought that it was ridiculous to be oppressed, and with prudence and courage managed to save himself by bringing about the intervention of Baffo. Then, lean, ragged, and perpetually hungry, but with the self-confidence of the first escape, he was put in charge of the learned, innocent Dr. Gozzi. Gozzi had a good table, a better library, and a heart. Casanova used them all with tremendous appetite. He grew like a wolf cub in spring. In a few years, he was the first draft of that swarthy giant, 6'1", muscled like a porter, acrobatically agile, which all the courts and jails of Europe were one day to know. This appetite that he found in a verminous kindergarten never left him while he had teeth. He was indeed to die of it. It did not exclude, and probably abetted, an equally healthy voracity for learning, which all the books and teaching of Gozzi could hardly supply. He ate the classics, Horace, chief poet of the unpoetical, the tidbit, as if they were fresh-baked bread. Nothing rebuffed his palate: mathematics, the natural sciences, history, poetry, plays, French and Italian, and fatally in that age of reason, when the marvelous is most sought because of its rarity, the arts of magic, astrology, the Kabbalah, alchemy. When he had exhausted the somewhat short range of the doctor's books on these last subjects, he turned to their respectable cousin, theology. He learned to play the fiddle, and Bettina, a minx of 13, took it on herself to give him long and complicated lessons on the complicated and idyllic personality of a born coquette. In this way he acquired the only education that makes a man interesting, without which the greatest specialist is only a walking factory, an omnivorous autodidacticism, nourished but not directed by a learned man. In those days, nimble wits were still the chief passport to mathematics. The sciences were richer in hypotheses that opened the imagination than experiments, and the great poets had not been appropriated by grammarians. Casanova, before he was out of his teens, had the elements of the best talker in Europe, save Voltaire. Only experience of life, the anecdote, was lacking. On this he now entered. His first step seems burlesque, without its somewhat subtle historical reasons. He received the tonsure of the minor orders from the Patriarch of Venice, and thus, after the custom of the day, became in title and dress a parson. The Abbé Casanova. In all such times in history, when the Church for its own reasons chooses brains rather than virtue to direct it, its constitutional role in society becomes more important than its teaching. Thus, in the mineralized Europe of that day, it was the only organic tract of society that remained, where there was still movement and where a career could grow. Consequently, towards this one free channel, the current of all the ambitions and energies of the age, from the ever-boiling lower strata of society, the rich in nothing but brains, like Casanova, tended to flow. It was no more extraordinary that a Casanova should take orders in that century than that the infusoria of the Gulf of Mexico drift towards the Gulf Stream. A recommendation, he had it from Baffo, and an education were all that was required of him. He entered the service of the Church without the least idea of giving more. With these facts in view, one must not see either contradiction, let alone vice, in the coincidence of this ordination, with his entrance and not exit from the world, and his first essays in love. From this point, the passion, pursuit, and worship of women becomes the high road of his memoirs, never long left for the most fascinating excursions in other adventure. Without attempting an apology, which he himself in his cowardly old age shrank from, except in the sense that all explanations are apologies, some obvious, if little-known features of this principal activity of the most active man of his times, seen from his own point of view, and more particularly of the secrets of his successes, must be set out. A rationale of seduction, indeed, is only to be attempted by sniggering old men like Ovid, though if it were based on the wisdom and practice of this maligned Casanova, it might have the result of frightening the majority of amateur woman-hunters from the chase. The only part of the immense burden social life has laid on the relation of the sexes that Casanova shirked was constancy, which, whether it is expressed in marriage or in the often more adhesive union libre, is only at bottom its economics, however ornamented. Both the mystical coating and the business core Casanova repudiated or ignored. Yet love to him was no more on a footing with any other pleasure than a ruby is with a garnet. A sweetheart was not a postprandial dish, nor any other of the inadequate things the pseudo-libertine makes of her. A trophy, a prey, or an instrument. His love for every one of the 1,000 was as real as any that led to holy matrimony. Only it did not last. So he escaped both alimony and the gluey years. But his women were not cheated out of their sacred due, for he gave them everything he possessed, and his whole self, in one single payment. Casanova was neither a bilker nor a gigolo. If all the subtle psychologists who have speculated on the mystery of his sex magnetism had realized this, we should have been spared much ingenious nonsense. Casanova paid. His love-making had nothing more esoteric in it than what every woman who respects herself must demand. All that he had, all that he was, with, to set off the lack of legality, the dazzling attraction of the lump sum over what is more regularly doled out in a lifetime of installments. How many times he unmetaphorically beggared himself for the paramour of a week. How many times at the height of his fortune he threw himself without hesitation or regret down into the gutter for a new charmer, and without any thought of a bargain, this for that. Let those envy his amours who can imitate him in this, and those who can add to it his real tenderness, that never forgot the name of one of his light of loves, or how beautiful she was, the irresistible riches of the talk of the man, the prestige of his shoulders, his neck and his eyes dare to emulate him. As for his censors, only those have the right to damn him who are quite certain the promise of life companionship of a man, however poor and tedious, outweighs all Casanova gave. The prime direction of Casanova's adventure, therefore, is the forbidden country of women. In the rise of his trajectory, his will is as single as Alexander's. Riches and honours mean scarcely more to him, the son of a strolling player, the devotee of good eating and drinking, when they conflicted with his true goal, than to the Puritan air of the Captain General of Greece. Such bizarre equivalences encourage a search for another parallelism. of their initial renunciations, as it were their ritual entry into adventure. Had Casanova his Bosphorus transit, his solemn propitiation of chance by sacrifice of his line of retreat? There was a certain Senator Malipiero, rich, handsome, a bachelor, and 80 years old. After 40 years' enjoyment of the highest offices of the state of Venice, he had retired to his magnificent palace to nurse his gout and continue platonically his passion for beautiful women. The first benefit of Casanova's new status of abbé was an introduction to this man. Malipiero was so pleased with him that he took him under his protection and put a room at his disposal. He shared Malipiero's exquisite luxury, and through his influence could hope for a brilliant career. The star, or the moon of the senator's harem at this time, was the youthful daughter of an actress named Thérèse Imer, on whose beauty, affected modesty, and talents Malipiero jealously doted. The young abbé, out of gratitude to the old sybarite and also because he was occupied in the first enthusiasm of his first amour with the two sisters, Nanette and Martin, more than by prudence, steeled himself for as long as he could against this delicious Thérèse. But after a period in which the friendship of the powerful senator gave ever more promise to his future, the inevitable moment arrived when Thérèse showed her pique for the overdone coldness of Casanova towards her. Notwithstanding his knowledge of the ever-wakeful suspicion of his benefactor, the treachery of the servants, and the penalty of almost inevitable discovery, Casanova plunged into the risk, with the dash of Alexander distributing his kingdom, and was ignominiously caught, thrashed, and thrown out of the palace. Instead of a powerful friend, on the doorstep of his life, he had made a deadly enemy of Malipiero. He had to begin again, and at a very different level. The quick road to fortune was barred to him. He entered a humble seminary, where the only prize in sight was some poor parish priesthood, but even this unattractive prospect soon disappeared. He fell innocently into a seedy scandal where his pride and obstinacy led to another beating, in public this time, and another expulsion. He found himself without money, family, or friends, or even a roof. So far, we have seen a boy who, except for one fault which his youth might excuse, calls for no hard names. In the next act enters the true Casanova, whose individualism by no means stopped at breaches of the moral code. Casanova, the swindler. With perfect spontaneity, and no more hesitation before the laws of the penal code than those of the church, he proceeded to sell for his own pocket the few sticks of furniture his father had left by will to the rest of the family. A lawyer named Rosetta intervened and had him locked up in the prison fortress of Saint-André on the Lido. In this supreme misfortune, the rest of the traits appear on the portrait. The full man is before us in characteristic reaction, resolute, revengeful, daring, and lucky. He escaped from the fortress one night, returned to Venice by gondola. After a short hunt comes upon Rosetta, smashes 3 of his teeth, breaks his nose and throws him into the canal. Returns in time for a pre-arranged alibi. The whole operation conducted with the precision of a trench raid, or the professional hold-up of a bank. Its very success superheated the hostilities to him in Venice. He resolved not to wait for the riposte of Rosetta, or for some still more redoubtable move from Malipiero, braves dagger or state prison, and as soon as a quibble in the law arranged his release, Casanova left the city. In his stay with the cultured old epicure, Casanova had learnt 2 Latin saws, which were to be for the rest of his life his gospel and his policy. Fata viam inveniunt, volentem ducit, nolentem trahit. As we may say, fate finds the way, and life leads its lover, betrays its rebel. The one handed down from the Stoics through Epictetus and Seneca. The second, a translation by Cicero of a line in a lost tragedy of Euripides. There is no better epitome of the purest tradition of adventure, with all the comfort of fatalism without its enervating effects. No better summary of the mystical doctrine of adventure. Casanova held to them like a Calvinist to his Bible, and repeating them to himself, set out on his next adventure in good spirits. A few months before, in the time of his good fortune, he had received a letter from his mother at Dresden, with a recommendation to an obscure monk whom she claimed to have presented to a bishopric in the south of Italy. When Malipiero was his friend, Casanova had no need of this brother Bernardino, Bishop of Martirano, by the grace of God, the Holy Father, and my mother. Now, he did not think the journey of almost the entire length of the peninsula too much to find him. He intended to go round to Rome by sea and booked a passage in a coasting vessel. But at Chiozza, a few leagues from Venice, his education progressed a new stage. He accepted an invitation to a card party from a one-eyed monk, who claimed to have heard of his fame as a versifier and lost every penny and every shirt the first night. The road fate indicated, therefore, had to be done on foot. Had it not been for the shameless cunning of another monk, a certain red-haired rogue named Stefano, worthy to figure in Gil Blas or the galleys, our worshipper of fate and woman would certainly have died of starvation and misery before he had gone halfway. The protégé of Malipiero does not spare hard words on his companion, who he recalls was foully dirty, utterly ignorant, brutal, naive, lazy, a beggar always, thief sometimes, and not above an occasional murder. But with many quarrels, by profiting by his instructions, and sometimes of the fruits of his industry, Casanova arrived at Rome. The bishop had long ago left for his diocese, and Casanova set out to follow him, on the savage and little frequented road southwards. At Portici his fate, as if pleased with his indomitable persistence, began to be a little kinder. He met a rich Greek merchant, a trader in mercury, at Portici, and succeeded in selling him a device for the adulteration of his wares with lead and bismuth. In return, the Greek only half cheated him. Out of this typical deal, Casanova had enough to complete the journey in better style. At Martirano, the worst disappointment all awaited him. The bishop was there, an unhappy, disappointed man, of mediocre talents and ambitions, but too high for his post and his prospects. The population was much as it is today, poor, mean, and rustic. The sea was not a prize, but a prison or an exile. Casanova, with the remaining sequins of the Greek still lining his pockets, summed up the situation in a single night. The next morning he told the good prelate that he did not feel the vocation to die a martyr, after a few months in his distressful town. "Give me," I added, "your benediction, and leave to go. Or rather, come with me. I give you my word, we will make our fortune elsewhere." This proposition made the bishop laugh heartily several times during the rest of the day, but if he had accepted it, he would not have died as he did 2 years after, in the flower of his age. This decision, this speech perhaps, is worth any of Alexander. The bishop gave him a letter of credit for 60 ducats drawn on a merchant of Naples. Casanova, in return, pressed on him an enamelled case, worth at least the same sum, which he had cajoled from his fraudulent Greek, and set out, neither disappointed nor tired. His condition had so changed that he is now distrustful of his company in the stagecoach, who do not appear to him to have the appearance of honest men. At Naples, he is received with open arms by the banker, who tells him, "The bishop has written of you that you are positively sublime." He accepted his hospitality, and by him is introduced to the best society of Naples, and his first great conquest, Donna Lucrezia, a beauty of birth, riches, and importance. After a short but brilliant stay, he proceeds, once more fate's favourite, to Rome. This second visit is a contrast which pleases him and makes him think almost sentimentally of his first introducer, Brother Stephen. Thanks to his Neapolitan relations, he obtains a post of private secretary to Cardinal Acquaviva, the protector of Spain and Naples at the Vatican, a European personality, in whose suite he approaches and is noticed by the Pope himself, Benedict XIV. The great world found the tall young abbé fascinating company. He learns eagerly their ways, and especially the vital difference between discretion and dullness. The way seems clear to an even greater career than Malipiero could offer, and he has the inner satisfaction of knowing it was opened to him by his wits and destiny alone. Perhaps the summit of this prosperity was the famous picnic at Tivoli, where he outdid in ingenuity and outrageous success, at the expense of the too modest husband of Lucrezia and brother-in-law of Angelica, the most celebrated tales of the Decameron. But his goddess, Chance, as if anxious not to lose this promising catechumen so early, soon demanded of him the same sacrifice that he made to Thérèse Imer. Naturally, the catastrophe came about through a girl, a certain Barbara Dell'Acqua, daughter of a professor whom the cardinal had engaged to improve Casanova's French. Casanova here plays, almost for the first time, the noble role. Not that he had abandoned his antisocial code of morals, which would have brought the greatest confusion into his life and excluded him from the list of great adventurers, but by the necessary hazard, which only a perfect parallelism could exclude, that here the divergent lines coincided. For once, that is, Casanova's notion of a good action was that of society, tradition, and religion. This poor, silly Barbara had plunged into a passionate love affair with a young Roman noble, with interesting and visible results, to mend which they planned a midnight elopement. Casanova, who had watched the development of the affair with indulgence, was lodged in the cardinal's palace. The police, incited by the family of the young nobleman, surprised the couple as soon as they had left her lodgings, in spite of her disguise. She had put on the cassock and shovel hat of an abbé, and chased her to the very door of Casanova, where in her frightened selfishness she fled. They did not dare to enter, but kept watch all night. Casanova did not hesitate, though he was aware of the risk, and had no other interest in the girl but humanity. He yielded his bed to her, and in the early morning smuggled her out to safety through a secret door. The affair caused a scandal, which the cardinal, though no Puritan, either for himself or others, could not tolerate. He sent for Casanova, and in a speech full of nobility and kindliness, told him that Rome believes that the wretched girl is either your mistress or mine. He agreed that to turn her away in her distress would have been an action unworthy of a man of heart. But he was obliged to ask Casanova not only to leave his service, but Rome itself. Casanova makes no attempt to conceal that this dismissal plunged him into a sombre despair. Ruin meant something more definite to him than when he risked the siesta hours in Malipiero's library with Thérèse Imer, and the horrible tramp world of Brother Stephen, the vermin of wayside inns, the icy nights and dusty days on the road that he had half forgotten, rushed back into likelihood. Nevertheless, the measure of the youngster is in the answer he made to the cardinal's pressing offer to give him a letter of recommendation to any other capital city that would enable him to make a new, if less brilliant start elsewhere. Constantinople. The equivalent of Timbuktu, or I don't care a damn. As he would give no other answer, the cardinal shrugged his Spanish shoulders and replied, "I thank you for not having named Ispahan, which would have embarrassed me." Next day, Casanova received a passport for Venice, and a sealed letter addressed to the high and noble lord, Osman Bonneval, Pacha of Caramani, at his palace in Constantinople. With this, a purse of 700 sequins, which with what he had already, made up the say, $2,000. The contemplation of this round sum, and the queer name on his letter, already consoled him a little. Volentem ducit nolentem trahit. He went to say goodbye to Lucrezia. She had heard of his disgrace, and refused to see him. The next day, he hired a place in a post-chaise for the north. The only other occupants were a lady and her daughter. The girl was ugly. It was a boring journey. So ends the apprenticeship of Casanova. Long before Venice, he is forced to abandon the carriage because the road is blocked by soldiers, the Spanish and Austrian armies in their winter quarters. The cardinal's passport enables him to pass their opposing lines without difficulty, but he loses his trunk with all his changes of clothing and his passport. At Bologna. After I had written to Therese Bellino, I thought about buying a change of linen, and since the return of my trunk was at least uncertain, I came to the conclusion it would be best to have myself made new clothes. While I thought of it, it occurred to me that it was not very probable that I would continue my ecclesiastic career. But in my uncertainty of what new choice I could make, the fancy took me to change myself into an officer. This idea was natural to my age. I had always seen the military uniform respected, and I wished to be respected also. Besides, he concludes, as I wanted to return to Venice, it charmed me immensely to show myself there in an attractive uniform. Accordingly, dispensing ourselves from any irony, as Casanova, no fool, sets the example, it is enough to state that he finally settled with the tailor on a white uniform with a blue vest, gold epaulets, and gold and silver facings. In this guise, he showed himself in the principal cafe and plunges into his new character. On his return to the hotel, he finds a letter from the new Therese Bellino, asking him to join her in Naples, a preposterous proposition, which, however, he says, put me for the first time in my life in the necessity of thinking before I made a decision. But the proximity of Venice, the new uniform, and the letter in his pocket to Constantinople were too strong for the charms of a girl who a few weeks before might have completed his ruin. He thus enters on one of the most complicated and shifting periods of his life. By miracles, hazards, profitable confusions, and prodigies of bluff, he got his new titles recognized and made the journey to Constantinople, passing through Corfu, in the pay of the Venetian army. There he met at last that Bonneval Pacha, a noble French adventurer whose life, full of prisons, chances, defeats and successes, is almost worthy to be compared to that of Casanova himself. But Bonneval, ex-general in 3 warring European armies, and now commander-in-chief of the Turkish artillery, was old and sedentary. He contented himself with admitting Casanova to his secret wine cellar and passed him on to some of his friends in the city after an amusing and instructive conversation lasting 2 hours. The adventures of Casanova in Constantinople are written in a far inferior style to the rest of his memoirs, on a thinner, cheaper paper than the rest, it is said. They bristle with chronological difficulties. Their matter is almost banal. The seduction of a slave in a harem, arguments on Mohammedanism with Epicurean Turks and so forth. All the commentators have felt a difficulty here, as if Casanova had something to conceal, and for the first and last time was consciously romancing to do it. But what that something was, something more than the penal servitude in a galley that one rumour hinted at for Casanova, had no ordinary shame, and cheerfully confessed worse things the most diligent search of the archives and registries of the time have failed to reveal. We understand by now well enough the character of the man to suspect that if this something did exist, and there is more than a mere failure of memory, it must have been rather some injury to his vanity than any other disgrace or misfortune. In any case, the Constantinople quest fizzled out. When he regains our interest, he is at Venice again, out of the army, penniless, hopelessly down and out. He is reduced to playing the violin in the orchestra of the very theatre of San Samuele, where his father, a score of years before, captured the heart of the shoemaker's daughter, Giacomo's mother. Seedy, down at heel, he settled down to the depths of Venetian life, as if all that had passed was a fancy. Doing myself justice, I no longer set foot in the good society I had frequented before I fell so low. I know they must despise me. I did not care a button. But the position where I found myself after having played such a brilliant role humiliated me. I kept my secret to myself. If I was worthless, I was not altogether conquered, not having in the least renounced the cult of chance, for I was still young, and that fickle goddess does not desert youth. His friends were of the same condition as himself. After the show, he would join them. Sinister companions who were the terror of the quarters of the lowest debauch and prostitution. Pimps, thugs, or only card sharpers and pickpockets, when nothing better presented itself, they would plunder unattended gondolas, or amuse themselves with brutal practical jokes, like the overturning of the venerable marble table placed in the place of St. Mark. The infamous culmination of this chapter was the kidnapping and rape of the bride of a poor weaver in full carnival. The friend of Aquaviva, Malipicro and Bonneval, could sink no further. At the moment when the likely consequences of this affair preoccupied him, the wheel turns for Casanova. It started like a confidence trick. He was leaving the theatre, masked and caped, for it was the third night of carnival, when he noticed that a man, dressed in the scarlet of a senator, in the act of stepping into his gondola, let a letter fall out of his pocket on the quay. Fata viam invenient. Casanova rushed to pick it up and restore it. Evidently, it was of importance, for the old man was profuse in his thanks and offered him a place in his boat and to take him to his lodging. On the way, Casanova's companion was suddenly taken ill. His left side became paralyzed, and he announced that he felt he was dying. Immediately, Casanova took charge of the situation, without the least thought that the safest course of a man of his reputation was to disappear. He orders the gondoliers to draw up at the canal side, fetches a surgeon, makes him bleed the unconscious senator at once, in spite of his protests, rushes both to the senator's palace, takes command of a bewildered and terrified army of servants, then installs himself at the bedside of the patient, choosing and dismissing doctors on his own judgment and authority until the old man is cured. This was the Senator Juan Bragadin, head of a very ancient and powerful patrician family. At first, in pure gratitude, for the seedy stranger certainly saved his life, he extended his patronage to Casanova. An accident, if the turnings in such a life are accidental, increased Bragadin's esteem to friendship and admiration, which lasted for many years to come. He discovered that Casanova, like himself, was a Kabbalist. Intense curiosity about the future and belief in supernatural means of discovering it are perhaps equally shared by the very timorous and the very adventurous. In the whole system of fortune-telling, whether by cards or by any of the countless ways of interpreting omens that have existed from antiquity to these times, there is perhaps a respectably metaphysical doctrine concealed, to be expressed indifferently by saying that chance is consistent, or disguising the paradox that life is instantaneous. However, it is certain that this superstition is a constant and not altogether accidental trait of your true adventurer. But while their opposites, life's cowards, who share the mania for fortune-telling, approach their researches submissive and trembling, it is curious to notice that the adventurer saves himself instinctively from logical and ruinous fatalism by a reaction, which is half childish and half cheating. Alexander would never stir a step without taking the omens. He charged in battle with a crowned oracle by his side. But when these omens were unfavorable, he violated them. As when before the battle of the Granicus, he altered the name of the unlucky month. As when the priestess of Delphi would not reply, he dragged her into the shrine by force and took her protest as auspicious. So it is a misunderstanding of his character and his type to say that Casanova disbelieved in his Kabbalah and was a mere charlatan because he often manipulated its replies. Chance, to him and to them all, is like Jacob's angel, to be tumbled for her blessing. This Kabbalah of Casanova, which now appears in his life as his main way of gaining a living, is curious enough to deserve a chapter. Here it must suffice to say that it was a variation, probably of his own invention, of the traditional oracle of the Kabbalah, which is an arithmetical operation based on a numbered alphabet or code. The letters of a question being substituted for their equivalent numbers, and these added, subtracted, and divided in an arithmetical pyramid, gave a numerical result, which, when translated back into letters, was the answer. The legend is, in the form of a poetical verse. Now Casanova's first clients, Bragadin, and his two equally eminent friends, Senators Dandolo and Barbaro, who soon joined the séance, were by no means imbeciles, and perfectly able from their own science to check, at any rate, the results of Casanova's pyramids. His success with them, and their innumerable successors, was due partly to his own belief in what he was doing, partly to the immense complication of the laws of the operation and the extraordinary genius for mental arithmetic which Casanova undoubtedly possessed, which allowed him to move with dazzling rapidity up and down and across the columns to a result, which, in its main lines, he often had in his mind from the beginning. There was no vulgar trickery, more the refinement of a sublime card sharper, seasoned with sincerity and human logarithms. These two arts, his Kabbalah, and a much less expert skill in card sharping, were his principal means of support henceforth. Bragadin and his friends made him a good allowance. The practice of his arts made him affluent. His apprenticeship to life was finished. He was past journeyman adventurer. Venice was once more open to him, the high and the low, the masked balls and scented boudoirs of great ladies, the dark, sinister alleys, where in pursuit of some perverse beauty of the people, he would risk a knife thrust for a night in an attic. Beside the monumental details of his intrigues, each as dense and full as a national war, his memoirs have many sudden and delightful glimpses of the joys which the mere spectacle of Venetian life had for his enjoyment. Here he walks on the Piazzetta with the delightful feeling of fine linen on his body, and his best clothes admired by all. Then, leaning back on the cushions of a gondola, he mixes in the water traffic of the Grand Canal on a day of holiday, past the glistening palaces, down a shady canaletto, where the roses hang over the mildewed wall into the water, or over the opalescent lagoon to Murano. Capped and cloaked, with the diabolic white Venetian mask down to his mouth, he brushes incognito through the feverish vivacity of the Merceria, on his way to a forbidden love in a secret villa. Venice belonged to him from its clandestine card saloons, to its quay, where the honest traffic of market gardeners delayed him many a hot morning, as he passed on his way from a luxurious orgy to his bed. So passed 9 years, from his 21st to his 30th year, broken by amusing trips to Milan, Parma, Bologna, even to Geneva and Paris, almost always fortunate, animated by the tireless verve that never allows his long record of the time to drag. His adventures with women become more complicated, even more numerous. In spite of the progressive shortening of the period of each amour, he seems to be more and more entangled in a huge skein of the threads of intrigue, counter-intrigue, from which at the psychological crisis, when it seems inevitable that he has lost himself, the laughing brown giant shakes himself clear, and never once does he sink to a mere lady-killer or a mere libertine. Not one of his loves is a repetition, and hardly one is without a human, almost artistic charm. He is like the vital principle itself, ever spending itself, ever renewing itself in inexhaustible originality, for the many-hearted Casanova had no need of recoining himself. To every sweetheart, he gave himself exclusively. He had so many selves. No such vast exploration of the forbidden world has ever been made. And no one gives us the impression like this man in his simple, unboasting narrative of being on the brink of a discovery, an induction, which this age above all others would like to know. What is the essential woman, beneath all those ingrained meannesses, parasitisms, prudences, which ages of a man-made world have set upon her? What is the woman behind the conventions? Only he who approached her there, not merely skin to skin, but heart to heart in infinite variations of circumstance, untroubled by the least restraint or the least prejudice, could tell us. If generalizations, utilities, or anything but his own bottomless egoism had interested him, At last the wheel changed its turn. In 1755, at daybreak, the Venetian chief of police, Capitan Grande, Matteo Varuti, entered his room and arrested him on the vague but formidable charge of irreligion and sedition. It may or may not be that this referred in some way to his activities in the new and occult sect of Freemasons. It is more simple and likely that the coalition of his powerful enemies had at last conquered the influence of the Bragadin circle. More important to him was the certainty, revealed by the place of his imprisonment, the dreaded leads of the Palazzo Ducale, that its term was to be life, without trial or explanation. He could not hope even for the little walk across the Bridge of Sighs. It is in this cell near the roof, heated by its situation and the dog days of July, in the company of solitude and the rats, that Casanova ended his youth. For more than a year he lived on his hopes of a message from the outside, another 5 months in a despair so great that once when an earthquake, it was the same day that Lisbon was destroyed, made the cell walls tremble, he shouted, "Another, but a bigger one, please God," which terrified his jailer more than the shock. Then one night he made the famous escape, one of the most extraordinary, if not the most extraordinary, in history. There were many difficulties, 2 apparently insurmountable. One was that the only entrance to these cells, the Piombi, which were a sort of attic in the palace, passed through the inquisitorial courtroom, which was guarded night and day by a post of soldiers on guard. The second was that he had not the least implement to attack the immensely thick roof, in the circumstances the only remaining possibility. 3 archers were always on guard in the narrow corridor outside his cell, incorruptible even if he had money, but he was penniless. Nevertheless, this was the problem Casanova solved. His prime secret is in his own words. I have always believed that when a man gets it into his head to do something, and when he exclusively occupies himself in that design, he must succeed whatever the difficulties. That man will become Grand Vizier or Pope. He will upset a dynasty, provided he starts young and has the brain and perseverance necessary. For when a man has arrived at the age that chance despises, he can no longer do anything, for without her aid there is no hope. His tools, which he found at long intervals, were a fragment of black marble from a chimney-piece and a rusty bolt. In a fortnight of work, so hard that the skin came off the palm of his hands and his arm was paralyzed through fatigue, he put a point on the bolt by rubbing it on the marble. After having taken a good omen from the chance remark of a priest who was admitted to confess him, he set to work to use it. 4 chapters of his memoirs are devoted to that rusty bolt and that piece of marble, to as many months of inhuman work and superhuman courage, tested to the last inch by the most fantastic disasters, which even at this distance and however imperfect the sympathy one may feel for him, raise the hair on the head. Finally, he stood on the roof and looked over Venice in the moonlight, only remained in a supreme burst of energy, physical force and presence of mind, to creep through a window, break open 2 or 3 massive doors, go down the main staircase, brushing guards, spies and clerks, into the square, and freedom. He is now 31 years old. In everything that follows, it is hard to recognize the same man. He had won by touching the extreme limits of human possibility. Henceforth, he is afraid of risk, though he must pursue it. Having got clear of the Venetian states at a cost which is an anticlimax, only to his escape from prison, penniless, ragged, hunted, he finally reached Paris. It was his second visit, but most of those who knew his gayer self were gone or did not recognize him. Nevertheless, he had cards in reserve. The best was the Abbé de Bernis, companion of Casanova's most scandalous adventure when he was ambassador in Venice, and now all-powerful Minister of Foreign Affairs. De Bernis showed a diplomatic pleasure at the reapparition of this haggard ghost of his past, and immediately set about finding him a place. Through his recommendation to the Duke of Choiseul, Casanova was appointed to the board of a state lottery, where he well understood his real task would be to watch the honesty of its two Italian directors, the brothers Casabilgi. His assurance had returned to him. His ambition was hardened to a fixed idea of becoming rich and powerful, so as to be forever removed from the return of that fate he had escaped. Against such an antagonist, the Casabilgi resigned themselves to take second share. In a few months, Casanova was rich, and since he had not forgotten the interests of his protectors in the process, well in favour at court. The reaction and the relief acted on his nerves. An itch to spend came on him. To reassure himself as to the reality of his gains, he set up a sumptuous establishment and began to rival in expenditure the greatest and most authentic lords of the court. Balls succeeded banquets, and orgies closed them. At the same time, his appetite for gold increased to a passion he, the libertine philosopher, had never had before. Every trick in his repertory was put to service. His luck at cards became insolent. The Kabbalah, and with it a thorough-paced cheat on the old motive of the philosopher's stone, brought him in thousands from the cranky, learned, perverse old Marchioness defy. Meanwhile, the government continued to employ him in business, which profited them both. In 1757, he was sent for the first time on a secret mission to Holland. He brought this off so happily that he was sent again, this time as the accredited envoy of the French king to negotiate a vast affair of currency. Again he succeeded. On his return, he embarked on a frenzy of spending. Casanova stood at zenith. It is not easy to follow the events that marked his decline, which he himself could never understand clearly. To him, these great days ended abruptly by an expulsion from Paris, caused, he was certain, simply through the jealousy of some powerful rival. In reality, it was a slope, rapid but not brusque, and the cause was in Casanova himself. Excesses that would be amply sufficient to explain the fall of any other man, stories of forged bills of exchange, duped or half-duped creditors, kidnappings, midnight quarrels with men of a class it is scandalous even to quarrel with, mixed histories of abortion, seduction. There was enough to damn anyone but Casanova. But if he had been the Casanova they put in the Piombi, all these things might have been passed over. They excused him for worse things in Venice. The truth is that he had ceased subtly to be an adventurer to become a noisy scoundrel. Or if that is too harsh, that he had no longer the irresistible charm of being the world's best loser. He was always greedy. Now he was grasping. He was always noticeable. Now he was loud. He had become, without knowing it, a social man, desperately interested in the stability of his own position, which he tried, without knowing how to do it, to link up with the stability of society. He had become a fortune hunter and shrank from the quest of chance. The supernatural shine had left his eyes. Men saw in him no longer Puck, but a rival. The degeneration is smooth, but it has its stages which tread henceforth ever closer on each other. In London, where he went from Paris, he notes, "I have marked this time, September 1763, as one of the crises of my life. Truly, it is from this time that I felt myself aged, but I was only 38. And in this word age, Casanova packs worry, timidity, loss of appetite for life, and a growing awkwardness in tight places, the symptoms of Alexander at Babylon. After a few months of unsuccessful and half-hearted, a new default effort in England, he fled again, this time far eastwards, to Prussia. Here again, failure. He manages to get presented to the terrible Frederick II, who browbeats him, sees through him, contemptuously dismisses him. Then to Russia, where he finds a Prince of Courland, all that he could desire, a gambler, debauchee, superstitious, a mad scrambler after the mirages of alchemy. But Casanova misses the chance, wearies the prince with his formulated demands of life, a stable position, a good sinecure, no matter what, provided it is sure and profitable. The blazing trajectory has dipped decisively. The infernal and elusive partner has won again. Casanova has not only ceased to be an adventurer, he knows it. Now, for the first time in my life, I reflected on myself, regretting my past conduct, no longer nursing any illusion, and shocked by the thought that there was nothing before me but the sorrows of old age, without job or fortune, with only a bad reputation and vain regrets to nourish me. He is nearly 50 years old. Let those who have the heart follow him further in his trudge round Europe. Cast off by the prince, he goes to Vienna. Expelled from there by the police, he returns to Paris with the same result. Madrid, Barcelona, everywhere he is undesirable and growing ludicrous. There is one last flash in Warsaw, when the grandee, Count Branicki, learnt in a duel that all but cost him his life what the sometime hero and imitation Grand Seigneur Casanova still had left in him. But after an hour's respect and admiration, which brought the blood back to his cheeks, he is arrested again. The police contented themselves with scolding our good knight, and enjoined him with the utmost firmness to continue his voyages elsewhere. So his graph, haltingly, but ever declining, approaches the deepest drop. Fall, Casanova, who was in his heyday guilty of every sin and every crime. Casanova, the card sharper, quack, thief, adulterer, seducer of nuns and schoolgirls, murderer, jailbreaker, and all the rest. Listen, you who hate him. He fell lower still. He returned to Venice. Bragadin was dead, a bankrupt. Dandolo lived in penury, a poor old man, nearly a beggar. Casanova was 52 years old. He applied for a post of police spy to his hated inquisitors, the court who had put him in the leads. By grovelling, he got it. His work was to furnish reports on the morality of the city. Some of them are extant. He did not sign them with his own name, but as Antonio Pratolini. In one, he brings to his employer's notice the scandalous scenes he has observed in theatres when the lights are turned down. Another gives a list of forbidden books he has seized from a schoolboy, among them the poems of his first friend, Old Baffo. He complains that there are nude models, young girls, in the art schools, and is practically certain that some persons who are not artists obtain admission under false pretenses. For these services, he received $10 a month. In 1781, the inquisitors dismissed him. There is a letter from him beginning, "Full of confusion, overcome with shame, knowing myself to be absolutely unworthy of addressing my vile writings to your excellencies," ending, "I beseech your sovereign munificence to allow me to keep on the post where I have been serving. I will work harder, so that I can live." Yet at this moment the prone man had a mistress, one Francesca Buscini, a sempstress, who writes of him in a letter, "That great man full of heart, of intelligence and of courage." They lived together in a tiny house in the Barberia delle Iole. I do not know if it still exists or can be identified, so we avoid the moral. We have two portraits of the man, one painted by his brother Francois, the other an engraving by a certain Berca, done when he was 63 years old. The first evidently belongs to the period of his effulgence, when he had a coat of grey lustrine embroidered with a fine and large point d'Espagne silver lace, with a feathered hat of the same ornament, yellow silk vest, breeches of crimson silk. When he affected jewels, my rings, my watch chain set with brilliants, my diamond and ruby cross, which I wore round my neck. What strikes one most is his eyes, uncommonly long and lit from within, as so seldom brown eyes are. In his age, his aspect changed as much as his fortune. He then looked like a bird of prey, if you are romantic, or like a greedy, seedy old blackguard, with that nose, and that absurd survival of the grand air. From Venice, he set out on his search again, and landed at last in the sinecure. Count Waldstein made him his librarian in his castle of Dux, in Bohemia. There were 40,000 volumes. His master seldom asked for one. The old man was a good librarian, and amusing to talk with when Waldstein brought a hunting party to the place. The rest of the time, he carried on a war with the other servants, the butler, Feldkirchner, the bailiff Loser, the Dr. O'Reilly, Caroline the wardmaid. They hated him, and put the villagers against him, so that when he walked outside the grounds, the boys threw stones at him, and the little girls ran to hide. After the first reprisals, he decided to ignore these people, and spent most of his time in the library. He kept up an enormous correspondence. Many of his old friends gradually drifted back into communication with him, and the books he set to writing in a constant stream brought him an army of other noble and learned correspondents. This comforted him immensely, for he had become a complete old snob. His memoirs, the supreme justification of his life, historically and artistically, were almost his last work. They were not published in his lifetime, but many knew of their existence, and some, notably the Prince de Ligne, were allowed to read them as they were written and encouraged him. They contain, complete and living, the whole of his times, an age which is amongst the most interesting, certainly the most civilized, if that word is to be given any meaning, that mankind has ever enjoyed. The Memoirs is therefore one of the world's great books, even in the mangled form that is all we are ever likely to possess. But this superb achievement is only the accidental function, the setting of Casanova's purpose, which was to recall, for his own amusement, the course of his own life. As that life was ultimately a sexual adventure, the boldest and largest ever attempted, and as Casanova, though he said he was mortifying himself, he had become pious as well as snob, wrote with gusto, even in his works, Casanova is only frequented by a select, or at any rate, a limited company. For this reason, which would also have pleased him, he is almost the only great adventurer that has escaped misrepresentation. No Plutarch could do anything with him. He died at Dux, 1795, of a surfeit.